Imagine you're scrolling through your favorite entertainment channel, expecting flashy headlines and quick gossip, when suddenly a name catches your eye: Clark Gable. You might recall the iconic mustache, the commanding drawl, that classic line, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." But behind that cool swagger was a whirlwind life that could rival any Hollywood script. Picture this: high-speed car crashes, hush-hush affairs, marriages that lit up every tabloid in town, gut-wrenching tragedies, and a passing so abrupt it left an entire movie on the verge of collapse. Welcome to a journey through old Hollywood glamour and heartbreak, where we dig into the secret child that no one dared acknowledge, the wife he lost far too soon, and the second heart attack that struck down the king of Hollywood in the midst of filming his final scene. He was born William Clark Gable on February 1st, 1901, in Cadiz, Ohio, to an oil driller father and a mother who sadly passed away before he turned 1. That early loss might have set the stage for a life filled with emotional gaps he spent decades trying to fill. In a world where silent films were just beginning to evolve, little Billy Gable was a restless kid who found solace in fantasy, reading, daydreaming, adopting a certain bravado. Growing up, he bounced between Ohio and Pennsylvania, forging an unpolished resilience that would later glimmer on the big screen. Even as a teenager, he harbored a quiet ambition. He wanted to be an actor. But let's be real. At the dawn of the 20th century, that dream sounded as outlandish as wanting to be a social media influencer in 1910. Yet Gable never wavered, always carrying around that burning desire. When he was in his late teens, he inherited some money from his late stepmother, enough to move to the West Coast and start fresh. No fancy agents, no sparkling contracts, just a young man determined to see his name in lights. Hollywood at that time was a magnet for dreamers, hustlers, and golden boys with broad shoulders. Gable drifted around doing odd jobs, from lumber mills to selling ties, but always gravitating back to stage or small film gigs whenever the chance presented itself. He bounced between small theater companies, picking up invaluable experience in front of live audiences. That stage training would later give his film roles a grounded, no-nonsense vibe. Even before talkies took over, insiders whispered about this tall, rugged extra who seemed to project real intensity. He didn't just stand there in the background, he commanded the shot. His first brushes with film weren't glamorous. Bit parts, sometimes uncredited, in silent movies that have mostly vanished to time. But with the arrival of sound in cinema, everything changed. That deep, manly voice made directors sit up and pay attention. MGM, the biggest dream factory on earth, recognized something in Gable's screen test that fired them up. A combination of rough-hewn masculinity and surprising vulnerability. Soon enough, they signed him, groomed him, and started placing him in roles that tested his range. While his star steadily rose, he caught a break that catapulted him to fame. A loan out from MGM to Columbia Pictures in 1934 gave him the lead in Frank Capra's It Happened One Night. That comedic masterpiece saw Gable unveiling comedic timing nobody suspected he had. Not only did the film sweep the Oscars, bagging Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, and Best Actor, but it sealed Gable's superstar status. People loved him. The gritty edges he refused to sand away made him stand out from the pack. But while his career soared, his private life started heating up in ways that make our modern tabloids look tame. In 1933, after a boozy night, Gable allegedly got behind the wheel of his prized Duesenberg. Picture the purr of that expensive machine gliding along the dark Hollywood streets. Then imagine the screech of brakes, the crunch of metal, and Gable's heart lurching as the car slammed into a tree. He was intoxicated, a scandal that could have tarnished his carefully polished persona. Yet this was the golden age of studio power, and MGM had the muscle to squash the story. The press never made it front-page news, leaving audiences blissfully unaware that their favorite star had nearly destroyed himself, and possibly others on that fateful night. Modern fans might ask, how did they keep it hidden? The short answer, the studio system had a near absolute grip on local law enforcement and gossip columnists. Hush money wasn't exactly taboo. One wave of the corporate wand and the incident vanished from public view. But if a hush-hush car crash raises eyebrows, wait until you hear about the next jaw-dropper. In 1935, Gable was cast in The Call of the Wild, a production that would pair him with Loretta Young. She was the angelic Catholic darling known for a pristine image. Sparks flew on set, and the ensuing affair was no fleeting fling. Loretta Young ended up pregnant, a situation that spelled career suicide in that morally rigid era. She retreated from public life, gave birth to Judy Lewis in absolute secrecy on November 6, 1935, and later orchestrated a complicated adoption story to mask the child's true parentage. Gossip swirl or not, the official line was that Young had adopted a baby girl. Insiders whispered that the child's ears resembled Gable's, and tongues wagged about hush money or silent acknowledgments. But to the fans, Gable was untainted, and Loretta Young maintained her saintly veneer. Decades later, Judy Lewis would publish a memoir confirming that her father was indeed the king of Hollywood himself. The studio system might have controlled the immediate scandal, but the truth lingered, waiting for the right moment to blow wide open. Yet Gable seemed unstoppable. By the late 1930s, no actor was more in demand. He had that perfect on-screen synergy with Joan Crawford and Jean Harlow, but the real talk was about how he effortlessly switched from comedic banter to macho action to romantic lead. Then came his role as Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind, 1939, forever cementing him as a cinematic legend. That same year, his messy personal life spilled into the headlines again. This time, it was official. On March 7, 1939, Gable's divorce from his second wife, Maria Rhea Langham, was finalized. The tabloids devoured every detail, especially the rumors swirling about an ongoing romance between Gable and Carole Lombard, one of Hollywood's comedic gems. The divorce was costly, heated, and gave paparazzi plenty of fresh fodder. Gable's fans, however, seemed endlessly forgiving, enthralled by the star's roguish charm. Once the legal dust settled, Gable wasted no time making headlines once more. On March 29, 1939, just a few weeks post-divorce, he tied the knot with Carole Lombard, forging one of Tinseltown's most storied romances. They were the it couple. Lombard was as quick-witted and vivacious as Gable was laid back and sly. They bought a ranch in Encino, hosting parties that blended high society glam with down-to-earth fun. Lombard famously teased Gable about everything from his ears to his morning coffee preferences. He in turn adored her spontaneity. Fans went wild for this union, seeing it as proof that even in an industry of illusions, true love could blossom. The marriage offered a glimpse of domestic bliss rarely glimpsed in Gable's roller coaster personal life, but fate is fickle. Fast forward to January 1942. Carole Lombard, who'd been on a war bond tour, boarded a plane headed back to California. That flight never completed its journey. The plane crashed near Mount Potosi, Nevada, killing Lombard along with everyone else on board. Gable's heartbreak was absolute. He had lost the love of his life in a flash, and the entire country reeled, not just for the comedic sweetheart Lombard, but for what that loss did to the man known as the King. Publicly, Gable was stoic, but friends saw him unravel. He reportedly locked himself in rooms, refused to eat, and drowned in guilt for not traveling with her. The paparazzi pounced on his raw sorrow, capturing photos that showed him pale and hollow-eyed, chain-smoking. The tragedy left an indelible mark. Some say he volunteered for the U.S. Army Air Forces partly as a means of outrunning his pain. His post-war film presence had a solemn note, as though part of him had died with her on that mountain. It's against this sorrow-laden background that Gable's longtime on-again, off-again entanglement with Joan Crawford reached new levels of complexity. This relationship, simmering since the early 1930s, now threatened to overshadow his entire career. MGM had always tried to keep them apart publicly, particularly if one or both were married. The studio dreaded the possibility of alienating fans or sponsors, especially after Lombard's passing. Yet the pair somehow found ways to circle back to one another, feeding the rumor mill. Their bond was rumored to be part passion, part mutual vulnerability. Professionally, this interplay sometimes gave them sizzling on-screen chemistry, but behind closed doors, it was a headache for studio executives who worked overtime controlling the narrative. In the post-Lombard era, Gable found himself feeling adrift, occasionally turning to Crawford for companionship. Fans loved the rumors, but critics scorned them, claiming it tarnished the memory of Lombard. Even so, Gable soldiered on, delivering roles that continued to delight the box office, like Adventure, 1945, and The Hucksters, 1947, though many insiders felt he was never quite the same man he'd been before 1942. As the 1950s dawned, Hollywood started changing. Gable, now older, recognized that the industry was gradually turning to fresh faces. Gone with the Wind alone ensures his face will flicker on screens for as long as film history is studied. Rhett Butler is often considered one of the greatest movie characters ever, a swaggering anti-hero who somehow made arrogance appealing. Yet Gable was more than that single role. From the comedic brilliance in It Happened One Night, to the wilderness drama of Call of the Wild, to the stoic reflection in The Misfits, he showcased a range that even modern audiences can't overlook. Hence, the King story draws to a close. Yet it never really ends, not while curiosity about that golden era still thrives. One might argue that in every re-release of Gone with the Wind, in every film student's dissertation on star iconography, in every vintage poster sold at collector conventions, Clark Gable lives on. The controversies might fade at the edges, softened by time, but they lend a sense of depth and reality to his image. He remains a riddle, part adored hero, part tragic figure, his name etched into the American cultural lexicon as an emblem of what it meant to be a Hollywood legend in an age when illusions and reality were almost indistinguishable. Call it a cautionary tale, call it a love story, or call it a testament to talent overshadowing personal chaos. However you label it, the life of Clark Gable stands as proof that behind every perfect close-up might be a wound left unhealed, and behind every triumphant box office record might be a personal storm raging just out of sight. That's Hollywood, after all, the place where dreamers collide with fate, and sometimes the brightest lights cast the longest shadows. Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, James Dean. But Clark Gable was no relic. He adapted, taking roles that leaned into his gruff magnetism. He starred in Mogambo, 1953, alongside a young Grace Kelly and Ava Gardner, proving he could still command attention. Off-screen, he continued to chase that elusive sense of peace. He married a few more times, each union capturing fleeting headlines but never quite recapturing the Lombard magic. MGM parted ways with him, a shock to fans who'd always linked Gable to the studio. But being freelance also meant he could pick and choose projects, at least in theory. Then came The Misfits. In 1960, Gable signed on for John Huston's moody, introspective film starring Marilyn Monroe and Montgomery Clift, two other Hollywood legends with complicated personal sagas. The Nevada desert served as a stark, scorching backdrop for a story about drifters and outcasts. Gable's character was a rugged cowboy, a reflection of his own aging persona trying to hold on to relevance in a rapidly changing world. Tensions on set were high. Monroe often arrived late wrestling her own demons, while Clift dealt with health issues and personal troubles. Gable, for his part, was in no mood for chaos. He insisted on doing his own stunts, roping wild horses under the unforgiving sun. Friends later argued that the physical demands and on-set stress contributed to his failing health. He was pushing 60 and had endured a lifetime of emotional strain, losing Lombard, coping with the swirl of controversies, carrying the weight of stardom. Something had to give. On November 6, 1960, shortly after the shoot wrapped, Gable suffered a massive heart attack. For a moment, it seemed he might pull through. He'd beaten adversity so many times before, but his body had other ideas. 10 days later, on November 16th, a second heart attack hit, and this time he couldn't fight it off. He died at the age of 59, leaving Hollywood in shock. The king was gone. The final heartbreak was that he never got to see the finished cut of The Misfits, which debuted in 1961, to lukewarm reviews initially, only to gain classic status over time. Fans worldwide mourned. Newspaper headlines declared Hollywood's king is dead. Those who had followed Gable's life from his earliest silent film roles felt a pang of nostalgia, as though an era ended with him. His funeral, held on November 19, 1960, was a solemn affair. In keeping with his wishes, he was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, right next to Carole Lombard. That final resting spot gave fans a poignant sense of closure. The star-crossed lovers rejoined, their tombs side by side, like the final frame of a dramatic romance. Everyone, from old co-stars to new industry hopefuls, attended, paying their respects. Hollywood paused to salute a man who'd become a symbol of masculine charm for an entire generation. Orson Welles, upon hearing of Gable's passing, famously commented that a certain spark of old Hollywood had vanished forever. Then came a postscript that few saw coming. On March 20th, 1961, 4 months after Gable's death, his fifth wife, Kay Williams, gave birth to John Clark Gable. It was the only legitimate child Gable ever had, a child he'd never meet. Some called it a bittersweet gift, the circle of life playing out in real time. Magazines published pictures of the newborn, remarking on how eerily he resembled his father. For longtime fans, it was a reminder of Gable's complicated paternal legacy, given that years earlier, Judy Lewis had grown up in the shadows of rumor. Suddenly the king had an heir. The phenomenon of fatherhood arriving posthumously lent Gable an almost mythical aura, a star so big that even in death new chapters kept unfolding. Now if you think the scandal parade ends there, think again. In the years following his passing, the hush-hush truths about Judy Lewis began surfacing more aggressively. Loretta Young eventually acknowledged, albeit indirectly, that Gable was the father, but neither star had the chance to see their daughter recognized publicly during Gable's lifetime. Hollywood watchers dissected this revelation in countless articles and mini-documentaries, calling it one of the most elaborate cover-ups in the golden age of cinema. Judy Lewis herself wrote about the emotional turmoil she experienced, growing up suspecting that Gable was her father, only to face a wall of denials. She once tried to pin back her prominent ears surgically, largely because she'd been teased about their resemblance to Gable's. By the time the truth was fully out in the open, Gable was long gone, and the era that permitted such intense secrecy had already started to fade. What then is Clark Gable's legacy if we sift through the wreckage of heartbreak, rumor, and tragedy? Let's be frank, he remains a cinematic powerhouse.